Samuel Green had always believed that life should be simple. For as long as he could remember, his world revolved around a quiet stretch of land on the edge of a small Georgia town. The property wasn't much to outsiders, just 20 acres of rolling grass, a cluster of old oak trees, and a little red barn that stood proudly like a sentinel at the edge of his field. But to Samuel, it was everything. It was history, it was family, and it was home. The barn had been built by his father, Henry Green, nearly 50 years ago. Samuel could still remember being a little boy, watching his father hammer each nail with patient care. Back then, money was tight, and every plank of wood had been carried by hand, every beam lifted with neighbors' help, and every brick laid with love. His father used to say, "A man's barn is more than wood and nails, Sam. It's where dreams are stored." For Samuel, those words stayed true. The barn wasn't just a place to store tools, hay, and feed, it held memories of his childhood, his father's laughter, and the rhythm of simple country living. Inside, the scent of cedar mixed with old hay, and sunlight always found its way through the small cracks in the walls, giving the space a warm, golden glow in the afternoons. Even when his father passed away, Samuel kept the barn exactly as it was, a living reminder of the man who built it. Life for Samuel was peaceful, at least, it used to be. About 10 years ago, a group of investors bought the land next to Samuel's property and transformed it into a luxury resort community. They called it Lakewood Springs, and soon the quiet countryside Samuel had always known began to change. The once empty fields were replaced by rows of modern vacation homes with white fences and shining windows. Golf carts buzzed up and down the newly paved streets, and on weekends, the resort was full of visitors from the city looking for an escape from their busy lives. At first, Samuel didn't mind. He figured everyone had the right to enjoy the lake and the land in their own way. He kept to himself, tended to his fields, and waved politely when new faces passed by his property. But as the years went on, he started to notice something unsettling about the people managing the resort, especially the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that oversaw everything within Lakewood Springs. The HOA was run by Richard Cole, a man in his early 50s with perfectly combed silver hair and a sharp way of speaking. Richard was always dressed in crisp polo shirts and expensive sunglasses, and he carried himself as if the entire resort belonged to him personally. While Samuel had no interest in the HOA's rules and meetings, it became clear that Richard had a growing interest in Samuel's land. It started subtly. First, there were friendly letters from the HOA welcoming Samuel to the community, even though his land wasn't technically part of the resort. Then came invitations to social gatherings and charity events, which Samuel politely declined. Eventually, the tone of the letters changed. They began suggesting collaboration opportunities, hinting that Samuel's old barn diminished the visual harmony of the resort. To Samuel, it was just polite wording for something more direct. They didn't like the look of his property. Samuel ignored the letters. He had every right to live the way he always had. His land had been in his family for generations, long before Lakewood Springs existed, and he had no intention of changing a thing. But ignoring the HOA seemed to make them push harder. Some resort residents, trying to be friendly, would mention things to Samuel in passing. "You know, Mr. Green," one neighbor said one afternoon while jogging by, "Richard's been talking about how much better the lake would look if that barn wasn't in the way. He says it blocks the sunset view from the clubhouse deck." Samuel would just nod, smile faintly, and continue on his way. He wasn't one to argue, but deep down, he was beginning to sense trouble. Despite the growing tension, Samuel found comfort in his routines. Every morning, he'd wake up before sunrise, make a pot of coffee, and sit on his porch watching the mist roll across the fields. Birds chirped in the oak trees, and sometimes deer wandered close enough that he could hear their soft footsteps in the grass. These quiet moments reminded him why he stayed, why he'd never sell, no matter how tempting the offers became. And oh, the offers came. Over the years, Richard and the HOA tried everything to buy Samuel out. At first, they sent polite proposals, offering fair compensation. When Samuel refused, the offers became more aggressive. One representative even showed up at his door one summer afternoon, carrying a folder full of paperwork and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Green," the man began smoothly, "Lakewood Springs is expanding, and your property is right in the heart of our future plans. If you agree to sell now, we're prepared to offer you well above market value." Samuel leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "This land isn't for sale," he said simply. The man's smile faltered, but he nodded, closing the folder. "I understand, sir. But I'd encourage you to think about it. Things are changing fast around here." Samuel didn't need to think about it. His answer would always be the same. Still, the pressure from the HOA didn't stop. Rumors began circulating that they were looking for loopholes in zoning regulations to force Samuel to comply with community standards. Friends warned him that Richard had connections at the county office and knew how to get things done behind closed doors. Samuel tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he wasn't breaking any laws. His barn was on his land, built legally decades before Lakewood Springs even existed. He had nothing to fear, or so he thought. What Samuel didn't realize was that the HOA's patience was wearing thin. In their eyes, his little red barn was more than an eyesore. It represented resistance, a refusal to bow to their vision of a perfectly manicured community. And for people like Richard Cole, resistance was something to be eliminated. But Samuel, quiet and steady as he was, had a strength no one saw coming. Years of working the land had taught him patience and persistence. He didn't believe in rushing into fights, but he also didn't believe in giving up what was rightfully his. On warm evenings, he'd sometimes sit by the lake with an old notebook, sketching ideas for small repairs he wanted to make to the barn, maybe a fresh coat of paint or stronger roof beams. He wasn't planning to tear it down or replace it with something modern, he just wanted to preserve it the way his father would have wanted. That barn was part of his identity, part of his family's story. And then, there was the lake itself, shimmering and calm, stretching along the edge of both his land and the resort's property. Few people knew it, but Samuel's father had signed an easement agreement decades earlier, giving the Green family control over the dam valve that regulated the lake's water level. It wasn't something Samuel thought about often. Maintaining the valve was just one of those quiet responsibilities he'd inherited, like keeping the fields trimmed or mending the old fence line. To Samuel, the lake was simply part of the landscape he'd grown up with. To the HOA, though, it was the centerpiece of their luxury paradise, the reason city dwellers paid premium prices for weekend getaways. Without that sparkling lake, Lakewood Springs would lose its magic. Samuel didn't realize it yet, but buried within that old easement agreement lay a quiet kind of power, one that would eventually turn the tables in ways no one could have imagined. For now, though, life moved on at its usual pace. Samuel fed his chickens, repaired the fences, and drove his old pickup into town once a week for supplies. He kept his distance from the resort crowds, preferring the company of his land and his memories. But beneath the calm surface, pressure was building slowly, quietly, like water behind a dam. Something was coming. Samuel didn't know when, and he didn't know how. But deep in his gut, he felt it. The days of quiet living were numbered. The summer sun rose slowly over Samuel Green's land, bathing the fields in a soft golden glow. The morning air was warm and still, and the smell of fresh grass carried on a light breeze. Samuel woke up early, as he always did, brewed his coffee, and sat on the porch watching the mist drift lazily across the lake. To him, mornings like these were a reminder of why he loved this land so much: quiet, peaceful, untouched by time. That morning felt no different than any other, but Samuel had no idea his life was about to change. After finishing his coffee, he grabbed his keys, climbed into his old blue pickup truck, and headed into town for supplies. The drive was familiar, winding past tall pines and stretches of open field. He picked up a few sacks of chicken feed, some fencing material, and a new set of tools he'd been meaning to buy. He took his time, chatting with the store owner, catching up with old friends at the feed shop, and finally stopping by the diner for a quick lunch. By the time Samuel turned onto the dirt road leading back to his property, the sun was high, and the heat pressed heavily against the earth. As he drove closer, though, something strange caught his eye. At the far end of his field, near where the little red barn stood, he saw movement trucks, workers, and clouds of dust rising into the air. Samuel frowned, slowing his truck as he approached. His heart began to beat faster. When he finally pulled up, what he saw made him freeze. His barn, the same barn his father had built with his bare hands 50 years ago, was gone. Not damaged. Not partially dismantled. Completely gone. All that remained was a pile of broken boards, splintered beams, and scattered nails. A bulldozer idled nearby, its metal tracks pressed deep into the soil, and a team of workers in reflective vests were hauling away what was left of his family's history. For a moment, Samuel couldn't move. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath caught in his throat, and the sound of the engine faded under the roaring in his ears. Finally, he stepped out of the truck and walked slowly toward the workers. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but beneath it, there was a weight, the kind of quiet tone that made people stop and listen. One of the workers glanced up nervously, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sir, we were told to remove the structure." The order came from the Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association. Samuel stared at him in disbelief. "Remove the structure? That's my barn. On my land." The worker hesitated. "We were just following instructions, sir. They said it was an unauthorized building." Samuel felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay steady. Raising his voice wouldn't solve anything. "Who told you this?" he asked firmly. "The HOA office," the man said quickly. "Mr. Cole signed the paperwork." Hearing the name didn't surprise Samuel. Richard Cole. Of course. Samuel turned away from the workers and looked back at the pile of shattered wood. Memories came rushing to him: his father lifting beams with neighbors, the smell of sawdust, the sound of hammering, and his younger self running barefoot through the barn's wide doors. Every corner of that structure carried a story, and now it was all gone. He took a deep breath, pulling out his phone as he walked back to the truck. Within minutes, he was on the phone with the county office, demanding an explanation. The woman on the other end sounded sympathetic but explained that the HOA had cited a zoning clause that allowed them to request the removal of any unpermitted or hazardous structures within designated community zones. "But my land isn't part of their community," Samuel said flatly. "I understand, Mr. Green," she said gently, "but according to the map on file, your barn sits right on the edge of a shared scenic easement. Technically, the HOA had the authority to request its removal. I wish there was something more we could do." Samuel hung up the phone, standing there in the sweltering heat, feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. Later that afternoon, he drove straight to the HOA office, a pristine white building at the heart of the resort. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and fresh paint. Behind a sleek glass desk sat Richard Cole, dressed as always in a neatly pressed shirt and a confident smile that never seemed to reach his eyes. "Mr. Green," Richard said smoothly as Samuel walked in. "I was wondering when you'd come by." Samuel took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed. "Why did you tear down my barn?" Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Your barn was in violation of community standards. It obstructed the view of the lake from several properties and posed a potential safety risk. The HOA voted unanimously to have it removed." Samuel stared at him in silence for a long moment. "That barn was on my land. It's been there for 50 years. You had no right." Richard tilted his head slightly, his tone polite but unyielding. Technically, we did. According to county zoning maps, part of your structure fell within our scenic easement. We followed all the necessary procedures, Mr. Green. It's unfortunate, but it's done. Samuel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "You've made a mistake." Richard gave a small shrug, as though dismissing the weight of Samuel's words. Sometimes progress requires hard decisions. I assure you, this was in the best interest of the community. Samuel walked out of the office without another word. That evening, he sat on the edge of what used to be his barn, staring at the pile of broken wood as the sun dipped below the horizon. The birds had grown quiet, and the stillness of the lake seemed heavier than usual. Neighbors stopped by throughout the day, some offering sympathy, others avoiding eye contact entirely. A few whispered warnings about the HOA, saying things like, "They don't stop, Samuel. They'll keep pushing until you give in." But Samuel didn't feel like giving in. Not now. For the next several days, he visited the county office, pored over zoning documents, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Everywhere he turned, though, he ran into the same wall. The HOA had acted within the limits of the law barely, but legally. His attorney confirmed it, shaking his head. "It's a gray area," the man said. "If you take them to court, you'll spend years fighting and tens of thousands in legal fees. There's no guarantee you'd win." Samuel didn't argue. He simply nodded, thanked him, and left. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing. On the surface, he went about his days as usual. He repaired fences, fed the chickens, and tended his land. But every time he walked past the empty patch where the barn once stood, the weight in his chest grew heavier. It wasn't just about the barn anymore, it was about respect, about dignity, about standing up for what was his. And then, one humid evening, as the cicadas buzzed in the trees, Samuel remembered something. Something his father had told him when he was a boy, standing by the edge of the lake. "Sam," his father had said, "this valve right here controls everything you see. Never forget that. The damn valve." Samuel had almost forgotten about it. Hidden behind a small gate at the far end of his property, the valve regulated the flow of water into the lake, the same lake the HOA built their luxury resort around. For decades, Samuel had quietly maintained the valve, as his father had before him. The HOA had never bothered to ask who controlled it, and Samuel had never seen a reason to mention it. But now, as he stood there looking out over the glittering water, he understood something the HOA hadn't considered. They might have the paperwork. They might have the lawyers. But the lake, the very thing that gave Lakewood Springs its value, depended on that valve. And that valve belonged to him. Samuel didn't act right away. He wasn't a man who rushed into decisions. But for the first time since the barn came down, he felt a quiet sense of control returning. The HOA thought they had won, but they had overlooked something important. Something powerful. Something they would soon learn not to ignore. Samuel Green stood by the lake one quiet evening, the soft orange glow of the sunset reflecting across the rippling water. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine, and dragonflies schemed the surface as if nothing in the world had changed. But for Samuel, everything had. The barn was gone. Every time he walked across that empty patch of land, where his father's work and his childhood memories once stood, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. The barn had been more than wood and nails, it had been a part of his family's story, something no one else had a right to touch. And yet, the HOA had done it anyway, without asking, without respect, and without remorse. For days, Samuel tried to move forward. He mended fences, tended to his chickens, and checked the fields, but his heart wasn't in it. Whenever he passed the ruins of the barn, he felt the same quiet ache. Friends and neighbors came by from time to time, offering their condolences, their words soft and unsure. "It's a shame what they did," one older neighbor, Mr. Willis, said as he stood by the fence. "They've been pushing everyone around since they built that resort." "I'm sorry, Sam." Samuel just nodded. He wasn't one to talk much, especially when emotions ran high. But while he stayed silent, his mind was busy. Late one evening, Samuel went up to the attic to look through his father's old files. Dust floated in the fading light as he opened the worn metal cabinet tucked against the wall. Inside were papers yellowed with time, property deeds, maps, handwritten notes, and contracts dating back decades. And then he found it. A folded document labeled Water Easement Agreement Green Property in his father's neat handwriting. Samuel carefully unfolded the papers and began to read. The agreement had been signed nearly 40 years ago between Henry Green and the county. It granted the Green family exclusive control over the dam valve that regulated the water flow into the lake, the same lake the resort had been built around. No one could adjust it without written permission from the landowner. Samuel's eyes lingered on the words, reading them again and again. He remembered standing by that valve as a boy, watching his father explain its importance. Back then, Samuel hadn't thought much of it. The lake had always been full, the water calm and beautiful. He'd simply continued maintaining it as his father had, turning the valve when necessary, clearing away debris, and keeping everything in working order. Until now, it had just been a quiet responsibility. But suddenly, it felt like something more, something powerful. He sat on the attic floor, the paper resting in his hands, and thought about the HOA, the resort, and everything they'd taken from him without so much as an apology. The lake was their crown jewel. Without it, the vacation homes would lose their charm, the clubhouse would lose its view, and the weekend tourists would stop coming. The HOA depended on that lake more than they realized. And Samuel controlled the lake. For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt a flicker of calm inside him. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was resolve. The next day, Samuel drove into town to meet David Foster, a local attorney he trusted. David was a tall, soft-spoken man with graying hair and a reputation for thoroughness. He greeted Samuel warmly as they sat down in his office lined with books and old photographs. "What brings you in, Sam?" David asked. Samuel handed him the easement agreement without a word. David adjusted his glasses and read carefully, his eyebrows slowly rising as he flipped through the pages. "Well, David said finally, leaning back in his chair. "This gives you full control over the dam valve. The HOA has no authority over it whatsoever." "You're sure?" Samuel asked quietly. David nodded. "Absolutely. They'd have to take you to court to change this, and even then, it'd be a long, uphill battle for them. This agreement is solid." Samuel thought for a moment, then asked, "What happens if I close the valve?" David looked at him carefully. "Well, the water level would drop over time. The lake would start to recede. And if you're asking whether the HOA can stop you, the answer is no, not legally. But Sam," he added gently, "are you sure you want to go down that road?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He just nodded, folded the papers, and slipped them back into his folder. That evening, he walked down to the edge of the lake. The water shimmered under the soft light of the moon, and across the shore, the lights from the resort's clubhouse reflected on the surface. He could hear laughter drifting faintly through the air, visitors dining on the deck, sipping their drinks, enjoying the view of the lake. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. For weeks, he'd felt powerless. The HOA had taken something precious from him, believing he had no say, no leverage, no voice. But standing there by the water, he realized they'd overlooked something important. Samuel decided not to act immediately. Instead, he took his time. Over the next few days, he quietly inspected the dam valve, making sure everything was in working order. It was tucked behind a rusted gate on the far side of his property, hidden by tall reeds and shaded by old cypress trees. Few people even knew it was there, and fewer still understood its purpose. Samuel ran his hand along the cool metal, checking the gears, the locks, and the wheels. Everything was sturdy and intact, just as his father had left it. Meanwhile, the HOA continued as if nothing had happened. Samuel still received newsletters in the mail, filled with announcements about upcoming community events, maintenance schedules, and proud statements about how beautiful Lakewood Springs had become. Each glossy page featured photographs of the lake sparkling, serene, and perfect. They had no idea that their paradise depended on a single valve and on Samuel's goodwill. One afternoon, while buying supplies at the local hardware store, Samuel overheard two resort residents chatting by the paint aisle. "I heard Richard's planning to add a second dock to the clubhouse," one woman said cheerfully. "He says it'll make the lake look even more inviting." Samuel didn't say a word. He simply paid for his items and walked out, a quiet sense of patience settling deeper inside him. For now, he wouldn't make any moves. But he was done feeling helpless. The HOA thought they'd won by tearing down his barn, but Samuel knew better. Every evening, he sat on his porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees, his gaze drifting toward the lake. The laughter and music from the resort carried across the water, blending with the hum of cicadas and the rustling leaves. Samuel wasn't a man who sought conflict, but he understood balance. His father had taught him that nature had its own way of restoring equilibrium. Rivers carved valleys, storms cleared the air, and water always found its level. Sooner or later, so would he. As he sipped his coffee and watched the lake shimmer under the fading light, Samuel whispered softly to himself, as though speaking to his father's memory, "They think they can take everything, Papa. But they forgot one thing: the water runs through us first." The thought settled in his heart like a promise. Samuel didn't know exactly when the time would come. But he knew this much: he wouldn't rush, and he wouldn't warn them. He would act only when the moment was right. And when that moment came, the HOA would finally understand what they had overlooked all along. The August heat hung heavily over Lakewood Springs, thick and unrelenting. The air was still, and the faint hum of cicadas drifted lazily from the trees. Samuel Green sat on his porch that afternoon, a glass of sweet tea resting beside him, his gaze fixed on the lake shimmering under the sunlight. To anyone passing by, he looked calm, peaceful even, but inside, his thoughts moved like quiet, steady water beneath the surface. It had been weeks since the HOA demolished his barn. Weeks since Richard Cole's cold words echoed in his mind. Weeks since Samuel discovered the old easement agreement giving his family full control over the dam valve. He hadn't spoken a word about it to anyone since that meeting with his lawyer. He hadn't confronted the HOA, hadn't argued, and hadn't complained. Instead, he had waited. Patience was something his father had taught him well. "A man doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard, Sam," Henry Green used to say. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." And now, Samuel was ready to let his silence do the talking. Late one humid evening, just after the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of purple and gold, Samuel grabbed his flashlight and walked slowly across his land toward the far end of the property. The crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the soft crunch of his boots against the earth was the only sound around him. Past the tree line, hidden behind wild reeds and shaded by cypress branches, stood the old dam gate. Few people even knew it was there. The heavy iron gate had been built decades ago, back when the county created the man-made lake. The water flowed through a channel controlled by a single, sturdy valve wheel, weathered but strong, maintained carefully by the Green family for generations. Samuel crouched near the gate, brushing away a layer of dried leaves from the lock. He placed his hand on the cool metal wheel, feeling its weight beneath his palm. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the quiet rush of water beneath his feet. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It wasn't about anger either. It was about balance. The HOA had taken something precious from him without respect, believing they had all the power. But they'd forgotten that the lake, the very thing their community depended on, began and ended with him. Taking a slow breath, Samuel turned the valve. The old wheel groaned softly as the gears engaged, but it moved smoothly under his steady hands. Bit by bit, he closed the valve until the water flow into the lake slowed to a trickle. Then, satisfied, he locked the gate, pocketed the key, and walked back across the field under the fading light of dusk. At first, nothing seemed different. The lake still sparkled under the morning sun. Families still launched their canoes and paddle boats, laughing as they drifted across the water. Visitors sipped cold drinks on the clubhouse deck, enjoying the view as they always had. But Samuel knew nature's pace. The change wouldn't happen overnight, it would be slow, steady, and undeniable. By the third day, the water line had dipped just a few inches. Hardly noticeable to anyone but Samuel, who watched carefully from his porch each morning with quiet patience. By the fifth day, the tips of the wooden support beams under the docks were beginning to show. A thin stretch of damp soil, darker than the surrounding sand, had emerged near the shore. Still, no one seemed concerned, at least, not yet. By the end of the second week, whispers began to spread among the resort residents. "Is it me?" one woman murmured as she strolled along the clubhouse deck, "or does the lake look lower?" Another man shook his head, peering over the railing. "I thought the same thing. Must be the heat. Happens every summer." But by the third week, there was no denying it anymore. The shoreline had pulled back nearly 3 feet, leaving wide stretches of exposed mud where families used to set up their picnic blankets. Docks that once floated gracefully on the water now sat awkwardly at an angle, their ladders hanging uselessly above the dry ground. It wasn't long before the HOA noticed. Inside the Lakewood Springs HOA office, Richard Cole paced back and forth, frustration etched across his face. "This can't be happening," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly combed silver hair. "The lake is the centerpiece of this entire community. Without it, the property values drop. The tourists stop coming. Everything falls apart." 2 board members sat nervously at the table, flipping through reports. "We've called the county," one of them said hesitantly. "They checked the rainfall data. There's no drought. This isn't natural." Richard stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. "Then someone's controlling it." That night, Richard drove out to the dam with 2 HOA contractors. When they reached the old gate, they found the heavy lock secure, the valve untouched, at least, by their hands. "The county says the valve is on private land," one contractor explained, gesturing toward Samuel's property. "We can't touch it without the owner's permission." Richard clenched his jaw, his voice low. "Then we need to talk to Green." The next morning, Samuel sat on his porch sipping coffee as Richard's sleek black SUV rolled up his driveway. Dust rose in the heat as Richard stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Morning, Mr. Cole," Samuel said evenly, his tone polite but distant. "Samuel," Richard replied, forcing a smile. "We've got a bit of a situation. The lake levels are dropping fast, and we think it has something to do with the dam. We need to increase the water flow. I'm sure you understand." Samuel leaned back in his chair, resting his coffee mug on his knee. "I understand plenty," he said calmly. "I also understand that the valve is on my land, and no one touches it without my say-so." Richard's smile faltered slightly, though he tried to keep his tone smooth. "Look, we can work something out. The lake is important to everyone around here, including you." Samuel took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down. "You mean the same way my barn was important to me?" For the first time, Richard didn't have a quick answer. Samuel stood, his expression calm but firm. "You came onto my land, tore down something my father built, and never once thought to ask me. Now you want me to open that valve for you. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I think you ought to sit with that for a while. Richard stared at him, his jaw tightening. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something in Samuel's quiet steadiness made him stop. Finally, he nodded stiffly. We'll be in touch, he said, retreating to his SUV. Over the next several days, panic began to ripple through Lakewood Springs. The lake that had once been the pride of the community now looked weary and shallow. Boats sat stranded in the mud. Paddleboards leaned against docks that no longer reached the water. The once picturesque shoreline had turned into an uneven stretch of cracked earth. Resort guests complained, their weekend plans ruined. Homeowners fretted about falling property values. The clubhouse staff fielded an endless stream of frustrated calls. And at every HOA meeting, one name came up again and again, Samuel Green. But Samuel didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or boast about what he'd done. He simply went about his life feeding the chickens, tending his fields, and sipping coffee on his porch. The same calm patience that guided him through life now held him steady as the HOA scrambled. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was simply reminding them of something they had forgotten: respect works both ways. Eventually, the HOA came back not with threats, but with apologies. Richard himself returned, this time without the polished smile or rehearsed charm. Mr. Green, he said quietly, standing at the edge of Samuel's porch, we were wrong. About the barn. About how we handled everything. We'd like to make it right. Samuel studied him for a long moment before replying softly, making it right starts with rebuilding what you tore down. And for the first time since the conflict began, Richard nodded without argument. From his porch that evening, Samuel watched the sun sink low over the lake. The water line was still low, the docks still stranded, and the HOA still scrambling to repair what they had broken: not just the lake, but their relationship with the man who had always been there before them. Samuel felt no anger, only quiet satisfaction. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't fought, and he hadn't threatened. He'd simply reminded them that even the smallest wheel can turn the largest machine. The balance was shifting, slowly but surely, like water finding its level. And Samuel knew, deep in his heart, that the HOA would never underestimate him again. It had been a month since Samuel closed the valve, and the lake at Lakewood Springs was still shrinking. Where there had once been a wide, glittering surface that reflected the sunlight, patches of damp earth now stretched outward like scars. Docks leaned awkwardly against the mud, and boats rested on dry ground, their hulls covered in dust instead of ripples. The clubhouse deck, once the perfect place to enjoy evening sunsets, now overlooked cracked soil and shallow puddles. Visitors stopped coming. Weekend bookings at the resort dropped sharply. Golf carts sat unused, and the restaurant that once bustled with laughter now served half-empty tables. Inside the HOA office, Richard Cole sat at his desk with his hands clasped tightly, his usual confidence replaced by unease. The numbers on the reports didn't lie: property values were slipping, and residents were getting restless. One resident had said it plainly during the last HOA meeting, what's the point of paying premium fees if there's no lake to enjoy? Richard had no answer. Finally, one late afternoon, a black SUV pulled into Samuel's driveway. Dust swirled softly as the car came to a stop, and Richard stepped out, this time without his polished air of authority. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and there was no confident smile on his face. Samuel sat on the porch, rocking slowly in his chair with a cup of sweet tea in hand. He didn't move or speak, he simply waited. Richard walked up the steps, his shoes crunching against the wood, and paused a few feet away. Mr. Green, he began, his voice quieter than Samuel had ever heard it. I came to apologize. Samuel raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, letting Richard continue. We handled things poorly, Richard said, his tone deliberate and steady. Tearing down your barn was wrong. We didn't ask. We didn't listen. And we didn't respect your land or your family's history. That was a mistake. Samuel studied him carefully. For the first time, he saw no arrogance in the man's expression, only sincerity. We'd like to make it right, Richard added. The HOA has voted to rebuild your barn, just as it was. We'll cover all the costs, and we'll make sure it's done properly. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on his cup. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Making it right isn't just about rebuilding wood and nails, he said softly. It's about understanding respect. My father built that barn with his hands, and you treated it like it meant nothing. I can forgive mistakes, but I won't forget how you acted. Richard nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. We've also prepared an agreement, one that protects your property rights permanently. The HOA will never touch a single thing on your land again without your consent. Samuel's gaze remained steady. Good. That's how it should have been from the start. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the distant hum of cicadas in the trees. Finally, Samuel stood and extended his hand. Richard hesitated for half a second, then shook it firmly. Within a week, work crews arrived, not uninvited this time, but with Samuel's full approval. Unlike before, they didn't barge in with bulldozers and noise. Instead, they came quietly, respecting the land as they rebuilt what had been lost. Samuel walked the site every morning, pointing out details from memory, the exact angle of the roof beams, the placement of the wide barn doors, and the shade of red his father had chosen decades ago. The workers listened carefully, following his instructions with patience. Day by day, the new barn took shape. One morning, as Samuel stood by watching, an older carpenter named Earl wiped the sweat from his forehead and said, "Your father built this right, didn't he?" Samuel smiled faintly. "He built it to last." Earl nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll make sure this one lasts, too." By the third week, the frame stood tall and strong, catching the morning sunlight just like the old one had. The wide barn doors were rebuilt to swing open smoothly, and inside, the wooden rafters rose high, leaving room for tools, feed, and memories yet to be made. When the final coat of paint dried, a deep, rich red Samuel stood in front of the barn, his hands resting lightly on his hips. It looked almost exactly as it had before, as though time had turned backward. But this wasn't the same barn. This was proof that he hadn't been silenced. Proof that his father's legacy still stood strong. After the barn was complete, the HOA returned once more, this time with the signed agreement guaranteeing Samuel's rights to his land. Not only did it protect his property, but it also acknowledged his control over the dam valve. "Mr. Green," Richard said when they handed him the papers, "we're grateful for your patience. We hope this can be a new start." Samuel read the document carefully before signing it, then gave a single nod. "A new start depends on remembering what happened," he said simply. "I won't hold grudges, but I won't forget, either." Richard didn't argue. He just nodded, understanding more than words could express. That evening, Samuel walked to the dam, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He unlocked the gate, placing his hand on the old valve wheel. After a moment's pause, he turned it slowly, letting the water flow freely again. Downstream, the lake began its slow return, filling inch by inch, day by day. Within a few weeks, the shoreline was restored, the docks floated naturally again, and the once dry patches were covered by shimmering ripples. Residents celebrated. The resort returned to life, and the clubhouse deck was once again the best seat in the county for sunsets over the lake. And everyone from homeowners to board members knew why. As time passed, Samuel's relationship with the HOA shifted. They no longer sent him unwanted letters or suggested collaboration opportunities. Instead, they treated him with genuine respect. Residents waved warmly when they passed by his property, and some even stopped to thank him for restoring the lake. Samuel appreciated the gestures, but he wasn't interested in being praised. He didn't act out of spite or power, he acted because some things were worth protecting. On quiet evenings, he often sat on his rebuilt porch, watching the sun sink low over the lake. The red barn stood proudly nearby, just as it had when he was a boy. Sometimes he thought about his father, imagining him smiling as the warm breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh paint across the yard. He'd whisper softly, almost like a prayer, "It's still here, Papa. Just like you built it." One autumn afternoon, a young couple from the resort stopped by. They introduced themselves shyly and asked if Samuel would mind telling them the story of the barn and the lake. Samuel chuckled softly, gesturing toward the porch. "Sit down," he said, pouring them glasses of sweet tea. As he told the story, he didn't speak with anger or pride. He spoke with calm patience, explaining how important it was to understand the value of land, history, and respect. By the time he finished, the couple sat quietly, thoughtful and moved. "You really changed things here," the young man said finally. Samuel shook his head gently. "I didn't change anything," he said. "I just reminded folks that some things can't be bought and some voices can't be ignored." Years later, people still spoke about Samuel Green and the barn at Lakewood Springs. It became a local legend, told around dinner tables and at summer barbecues, the story of a quiet man who stood his ground without shouting, without fighting, and without ever losing his dignity. The HOA learned their lesson. The resort thrived again, but they never forgot who controlled the lake and why. And Samuel? He lived his life much the same way he always had, tending his fields, caring for his land, and protecting the legacy his father left behind. The barn stood as a reminder, its red walls glowing in the sunlight, its doors open wide to welcome new seasons and new memories. Samuel had not only rebuilt what was lost, he had rebuilt something greater, a sense of respect, balance, and understanding between neighbors. Sometimes, when he sat on his porch in the quiet of the evening, he'd smile to himself, watching the lake sparkle under the fading light. Life had returned to normal, but Samuel knew one thing for certain: peace was worth protecting. And now, everyone in Lakewood Springs understood exactly what that meant.